Okay, guys, thank you for tuning in to this review of the Geometry Spring Interim Assessment. Before we started, I took a minute to write out some tips that are really useful when approaching this assessment or any other assessment, including the EOC at the end of the year. So let's not waste any more time. Tip number one, use your reference sheet. If you look at your reference sheet, guys, you have all of the formulas that you need, whether it's the area of a polygon or the volume, or which V stands for volume, or the surface area of a polyhedron or three-dimensional prism. And if you look on the other side of your reference sheet, guys, you have formulas such as the distance formula, the midpoint formula, Pythagorean theorem, slope-intercept form, which is probably doesn't apply to a lot of questions, but you have everything you need on your reference sheet. So tip number one, make sure you use your reference sheet. Tip number two, a lot of the questions on this, or there were a couple of questions on this assessment that were perceptual questions. And, there were word problems that didn't give you any pictures. So tip number two is really big. Draw a picture. Okay, draw a picture. And then after you draw the picture, input the numbers that they give you into the picture. And you're going to see, we're going to go over a couple of examples like that on this assessment. And if you had me for class, we've talked about this before. So this is probably just a review for you. But if this is your first time watching this video, then or any of my lectures, draw a picture that they talk about and then input the numbers on the picture that they give you. Step number four, if they don't give you any numbers, then use your own numbers, like numbers 1 and 2. You're going to want to pick numbers that are low because that'll make the math easier as you go along. Once you've done that, draw the second picture. Usually when you're dealing with surface area questions or volume questions that are perceptual, they're always going to be two pictures involved, even though they don't mention it. So draw the second picture with the new numbers so that now you have a comparison between two different pictures. After that, solve the volume or surface area of both pictures and compare them. So now you can make an educated decision about what happened. How did it change? Did it go up? Did it go down? By how much did it go up? Or did it go down? So these are basically very important steps here that you want to use when you're answering most of volume or surface area questions, perceptual questions. And the last tip that I can give you is mark up your test. It's very important. Unfortunately, you guys are going to be taking your test on a computer, which means that you're going to have to draw a lot of these pictures on your paper and then mark them up appropriately. When you guys see these marks that I put on this interim assessment here, I don't want you to think that I put them on there just because, this is a math class and I'm a math teacher. The marks that I'm putting on these images are marks that you should be putting in as well. Will every question require you to mark it up? Probably not. But some will, most probably will. And if that's the case, mark up your test. That'll give you a better chance of getting these questions right. Okay, so let's not waste any more time. Let's get started with the interim assessment. If we look here at question number one, it was a pretty simple question. It says, what type of polyhedron is shown here? Obviously, we know it's a polyhedron because we have faces all the way around on the top and on the bottom. We have edges, 3 edges that come together at one vertex, so we know it's a polyhedron. The first thing you should notice is that the predominant or the dominant image is a hexagon above and below. So we know that it's going to be some type of hexagon, and if you look at the choices here, they all have the root of a hexagon in it. But remember that we have all the lateral sides here, and so basically what we have is a hexagonal prism. Could they have tried to confuse you and ask you about a hexagonal pyramid? Sure, we'll review that a little bit later on in a different type of question. But basically, this is just a hexagonal prism, and they wanted to know if you knew that. So the answer to number one would be C. Let's move on to question number two. Question number two, they tell us that the vertices of quadrilateral A, B, C, D are plotted on a coordinate plane. So if you look here, here's my coordinate plane. Here's my quadrilateral A, B, C, D. And they want to know whether it is either a kite, a square, a rhombus, or a parallelogram. Okay? Well, looking at it, just without the markings that I put here, when you look at this image, you might think, oh, you know what? It looks like a parallelogram. All the sides look like they're the same, right? Well, in this instance, we could just probably use the slope to determine the length of the sides, okay? Instead of doing the distance formula from A to B and measuring that, and doing the distance formula from A to D and measuring that, that would require us to look at our reference sheet, right? And to use the distance formula here, and we'd have to plug in coordinates, and that's a lot of work to do for a question like this. That would take too much time. But how about we can just use the slope from A to B and the slope from B to C and from C to D and D to A to see what do we know about the size of this quadrilateral here, right? Well, let's start with A to B. If I wanted to get from A to B, I would have to go up 1, 2, 3 spaces up, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 spaces to the right. So I know that if I wanted to get from A to B, I'd have to go up 3 spaces and 5 to the right. Okay, so it's up 3, and 5 to the right. Right? Well, if I went from B to C, right? Well, then I'd have to go, or from C to B, I'd have to go up how many spaces? 1, 2, 3 spaces up. But then I'd only go to the left 1, 2, 3, and 4. So that's 4 to the left. So obviously, I can see that it takes more steps to get from A to B than it does from C to B. And the slope of this here would be 3/5, and the slope of this line here would be negative 3/4, right? Now let's take a look at from A to D, right? Well, from A to D, I'd have to go down 1, 2, 3 spaces down, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 spaces to the right. So I'd have to go down 3 and then 5 to the right. Okay, so I can kind of see, wait a minute, up 3 and 5 to the right, and then down 3 and 5 to the right. Well, that kind of seems they're basically the same. They're just one is going to be positive slope and one's going to be a negative slope. So I can see that there's a similarity in the distance between these two. That's how I know that these two are congruent. And let's look from C to D. Well, from C to D, I'd have to go down 1, 2, 3 down, and 1, 2, 3, 4 to the left. So that'd be down 3 and 4 to the left. So I can see here basically that the same number of steps that it takes me to get from C to B are the same number of steps that it takes me to get from C to D. That's why I know that BC is congruent to CD. That's how I know that these two are congruent. And then if I look here, I can also see that it takes me the same number of steps to get from A to B as it does from A to D. That's how I know then that AB is congruent to AD. That's how I know that they are the same. Now, if you notice, take a look here. The slope, well, first of all, I know that these two are congruent, and then that these two are congruent. So right away, it should probably jump out at you that this is a kite. A kite is a quadrilateral that has 2 congruent adjacent sides, right? And so we can see here that what we have here is a kite, okay? But you're saying, okay, well, how do I know it's not a square? Because choice B says that it's a square. Well, remember, in a square, all the sides are congruent, right? All the sides are congruent. Obviously, all of these sides are not congruent, so it's not a square. Choice C says what? It says rhombus. How do I know that it's not a rhombus? Again, in a rhombus, opposite sides are parallel, but they're also what? They're also congruent. So I know it's not, they're not, right? And how do I know that it's not a parallelogram, right? How do I know that it's not a parallelogram? Well, in a parallelogram, the opposite sides are going to have the same slope. So if you look here, the slope from A to D is negative 3/5, and this is negative 3/4. So they're not the same slope. Over here, this is positive 3/5, and this is going to be positive 3/4. So they don't have, so opposite sides don't have the same slope. So obviously, my answer here is that it is a kite, which is choice A. Okay, it's choice A. Let's move on quickly to question number 3. And by the way, guys, if I'm going really, really fast, I apologize. The number of minutes that we have per video is limited, so I'm rushing a little bit. But then again, one of the benefits that we do have of having this online is that you can go back and review it over. You can, press pause and rewind and play it over as many times as you like. So I apologize for the pace that I'm going at, okay? But you can always pause it and play it again. So let's move on to question number 3. Question number 3, they tell me that E is the midpoint of CD, of segment CD. Well, here's segment CD, and I don't know that E is the midpoint because they tell me. They also tell me that angle C is congruent to angle D. Well, remember, tip number 7 says what? Mark up your test, right? This is one of those instances where I want to make sure that I mark up my test. So what I did here was the first thing I said, well, I know that E is the midpoint of CD, right? Well, if E is the midpoint then of C to D, then I know that from C to E is going to be congruent. To D to E. So I put my little congruency dashes here, right? Everybody see that? I'm marking them. I'm marking up my test. I also know that letter C is congruent to letter D. So what did I do? I put my congruency marks there for the angles. Angle C is congruent to angle D. They are congruent. In addition to that, they also tell me that this is a 90-degree angle here. That these two lines are perpendicular, right? Well, I also know that these are vertical angles, so I know that this is also going to be perpendicular. Okay, so I'm just marking up my test. Well, what does that tell me right away? Right away, I know that these two triangles are congruent because I have an angle, a side, and an angle, which is corresponding to the same angle, side, and angle. So I can say that these two triangles are congruent via the angle, side, angle rule. So I know these two triangles are congruent. Well, if I know that they're congruent, well, let's take a look here. I know that if this is angle C, it's going to be corresponding to this side here, right? It's going to correspond to side AE of the triangle. And if I have angle D, it's going to correspond to side EB. And I also know that if these two sides are congruent, well, then I know that this side is going to correspond to angle A, and I know that this side here is going to correspond to angle B, which means that since these two sides are congruent, well, then angle A and angle B are also going to be congruent. Well, let's take a look at the choices now, right? Choice 1 says that angle A is congruent to angle D. Well, by the way, let me put 2 dashes there and 2 dashes there. Do I have any evidence or any proof indicating that angle A is congruent to angle D? No, I don't. I do know that angle A is congruent to angle B, and I do know that angle D is congruent to angle C, but I don't have any evidence that A is congruent to angle D. So right away, choice A is not going to be an answer. Choice B says that angle B is congruent to angle C. Again, do I have any evidence here from my marking up that angle B is congruent to C? No. I know that B is congruent to A, and I know that C is congruent to D, so choice B is not an answer. Next, let's take a look at letter C. Letter C says that CE, segment CE, is congruent to segment BE. Well, here's CE, which I've marked, and I know that CE is congruent to DE, but here it says that CE is congruent to segment BE. Are these two segments congruent? No, I don't have any information indicating that this segment and this segment is congruent. I know that this segment here and this segment are congruent, and as a result, I know that angle D and angle C are congruent. Excuse me. I know that angle A and angle B are congruent as a result of that, but nothing tells me that CE is congruent to BE. So obviously, by the process of elimination, my answer is going to be that segment AC is congruent to segment BD. Take a look here. This is the last side of both triangles, right, that we haven't touched. But I know that these triangles are congruent by the angle side angle rule, right? And I have this side is congruent to this side. I know that this side is congruent to this side. So the last side of the triangle must also be congruent. So I know that segment AC of this triangle is going to be congruent to segment BD of this triangle. Again, I know it's a little bit